Welcome to the University Network TV, where we scan the globe to give students, their families, and educators the very best tips for student success. I'm your host today, Dr. Crystal Rose, and on today's show, we're featuring our series, How We Show Up. These are human bios, there's stories behind our bios, and these are stories that make us human. Not always easy, not always straightforward. They're stories from which we may take inspiration, learn from, and grow. Today you get to meet Dr. Cammie Rolle. She's been conducting independent research for about a decade as both the research associate and doctoral candidate. She obtained her PhD in neuroscience at Stanford and is now a postdoctoral fellow working within neurosurgery and psychiatry departments at Stanford and the University of Pennsylvania. For her undergraduate degree, she attended the University of California, Davis campus, where she earned a BS degree in ecology, evolution, and biology, and a BA in psychology. Then she commenced her PhD studies at Stanford within the neurosciences, and since then has been awarded 3 fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the NSF, and the National Institute of Health, NIH. We've been hearing a lot about both of these organizations since COVID, and I'm sure you'll get to hear some tips she's learned along the way. Oh, and you'll want to know she's published nearly 20 articles in peer-reviewed journals, including Nature, and has presented over 20 peer-reviewed scientific posters. She's been invited to speak at national and international conferences in neuroscience, psychology, neurology, and psychiatry. Yes, folks, she's in high demand. But you will also need to know that Dr. Rolle has been mentoring high school students, college students, and post-college students in neurosciences and professional development since 2010, even before she commenced her PhD. Even more, if you are applying to any of the Stanford Neurosciences PhD programs, she's one person, yes, on the admissions committee. This means she gets to interview and she helps with the admissions decisions regarding incoming neuroscience PhD students. Welcome, Dr. Cammie Rolle.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. I'm very happy to be here and excited to talk a little bit more about my journey. So I started off with my BA, my BS. So I went to college with no research experience under my belt. And I started just trying to pursue psychology. That was my primary interest, with the goal of possibly going into medicine, possibly going into another field related to that. And I was really passionate, I thought, about science, although it was all the high school level physics and chemistry, and it was interesting, but not necessarily what I wanted to make a career out of it. So I had never really thought about pursuing science as a career. And I was in a mandatory biology undergraduate course when I was at UC Davis. And it led me to learn a little bit more about how they were finding some of the things that they were sharing with us, some of the things they had learned about biology. The professor that was teaching was actually a principal investigator of her own lab. That means she ran a lab that was dedicated to understanding biology, and she was one of the people that we were learning about in our biology books. And so I was just like, couldn't believe that I had access to someone like this, who was literally cited in my book I was learning from in college. And so I went up after class because she had mentioned her lab was there at UC Davis, and I just asked if I could volunteer and be involved, thinking there was no way that was possible at my level without any experience. And she happened to have an opening, and I volunteered in that lab for the rest of my college career. It was my first research experience, and I think it was the summer after I think I started that. So I think it was the summer maybe after my junior year of college. She invited me to go on a totally funded trip to Kenya to collect some of the genetic samples that we were looking at. So my job in that lab was to be running PCR analysis on ants. I was doing genetic work on literally ants as what I was doing. And to be honest, I wasn't actually interested in the content as much as I was interested in what this was, this lab experience, this research that you could be being paid to be doing was so interesting to me. And then we got the opportunity to go to Kenya together. So I went with my PI, my principal investigator, Dr. Maureen Stanton, And she took me to Kenya, and we collected ants, and we ran genetics, and we lived in a literal, it was like these little huts. It was part of an Impala Research Institute there. And we sat around a table and ate watermelon and talked about all these exciting things that people were doing, that all over the world they had come and were doing research at this Impala Research Institute. And I could not believe that these people were getting paid and funded to travel and to research and to talk about interesting questions they had and how they could answer them. Long story short, that's where I got into research. This crazy one-off experience that I never thought would come into anything other than maybe just an interesting experience became my passion. I did move away from the content of that particular lab and started going more towards what I was passionate about within psychology, studying neuroscience as it related to psychology and behavior, and specifically how it related to mental health. And so I had a few other research lab experiences that eventually landed me at UCSF my final year in college. And I actually made that commute a couple times a week from UC Davis to UCSF just to get that research assistant experience, all volunteer. And that was studying neuroplasticity that eventually actually led into a paid, which I needed after college, a paid position as a lab manager. And a lab manager is essentially an administrative role where I was able to kind of manage the funds and the oversight and the personnel in that lab. But also I was able to, in my kind of, as part of my position, but also as part of my free time, I was able to be involved in the research. And this is where all the doors opened for me. And I guess the final piece of my journey from UCSF was I applied after a couple of years. I took a gap 2 years, I believe. Or I intentionally only was going to take a gap year. And that in itself was really hard for me to stomach, because I was always so sure if I stopped moving fast that I would stop getting anywhere. And I think for me, that gap year felt like if I took that gap year, like what if I got too comfortable, and what if I didn't make it to that next step, and what if it looked like I was getting lazy? And so that in itself was a big concern for me. But that year is when everything happened. It's when I got all of my publications that started me out. And it's when I got all of my networking and exciting research experience that made me more passionate and more focused on what I wanted to study. And then from there, I applied for PhD programs thinking I was an excellent candidate. I was really sure that this would be my next step. And I applied for psychology, neuroscience PhD programs and got interviews to 0 of those programs. Despite having publications, despite having posters, and I did not totally understand why. So I took another year at UCSF, and I focused very intensely and aggressively on trying to do everything I possibly could to not from like getting feedback about why I didn't get in to trying to get more publications and more posters and leading more research. And it was a team effort. I went to a lot of the professors there and tried to get involved in a bigger way and more aggressive way. But beyond that, there was a kind of a pivotal learning experience, which was that I had information from one of my mentors that in the letters themselves, because I was coming in with a managerial experience, but more than that, because I was coming in as someone who was excited and making cookies and bringing things in addition to doing some of the research and being very rigorous in my own right there, the things that were getting highlighted in my recommendation had a lot to do with my personality and my contributions to the feel and the environment of the lab. And this was not from my UCSF lab member, but it was more like the general recommendation. It highlighted a lot about my personality. And so I had learned that you have to be a little careful to be hand-holding some of your recommenders in terms of how they're presenting you and the experiences that they're highlighting. And so what I did for the following round is I brought to everyone's awareness that I wanted to make sure that not only was my personal contributions highlighted, but also the rigor and the research and exactly the projects I was involved in. And so what I started doing for my recommenders, all of them, was giving a bullet point list on the things that I wanted them to highlight as my experiences and my contributions that used some of the keywords that I now know as someone who's been on the admissions committee for PhD programs. We actually highlight things like dedication or determination or rigor or independence, leadership. We literally highlight and count how many of these words are brought up in recommendations. So it's really important that you are your own advocate coming into this for your recommenders. Tell them what you want highlighted, tell them the words you want used. I think it's really important that we do that. just so there's not any accidental bias or accidental highlighting of things that actually don't matter in certain programs or any PhD program. And then that following round, I got interviews and accepted into 100% of the places I applied. And I was very excited to be at that stage just a year later. So I think a lot of it was advocating for myself in terms of the experiences I got and how I was presenting myself and how I was being presented. And it worked out for me on the other side. So I now finished my PhD at Stanford, and I am now, as Dr. Rose mentioned, a postdoctoral fellow in neurosurgery at both University of Pennsylvania, and I'm an affiliate researcher now at Stanford University. And so I'm very, very excited and happy with the work that I'm doing, with collaborating with psychiatry departments as well. And yeah, that's my journey. Thank you for having me.
Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today on TUN TV.